Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Joining us on this edition is Eric Yeung, who comments on China, precious metals, and many other topics. You'll find him on X at King Kong 9888. A lot of fantastic analysis and commentary coming from him. Welcome to the podcast, Eric.
Thank you very much for having me on, Abaji.
So tell us a bit about whatever you'd like to reveal about your background, the work that you do, before I throw a whole bunch of questions at you.
So, my background is contract manufacturing. I did that for 20 plus years out of Hong Kong and Shenzhen, China. And what we do is we basically, any customers come to us, let's say international customers, US, European, Australian, Canada, etc., come to us with a specification for a manufactured product. We would take that spec, go to a Chinese factory, manufacture that product, and then we would organize the logistics to ship that product to the customer. So that's what we did. Of course, in the process of doing that, we also developed some of our own brands, and we worked with our customers to develop their private labels.
All right, yeah, and you also comment a lot on precious metals and the economy and that sort of stuff. And you've gotten, we have some of the same people that we follow. You get shared as well by folks like Luke Roman and others, and so some heavy hitting commentary there. And before maybe getting to the economic stuff, I tend to ask my guests, and even if this isn't your special forte, because of your experience around the world, I think your opinion has weight, and it's for me of interest. And so, before getting into the economy, tariffs, and all that, how would you see? And you've lived in both East and West, so how do you see the current juncture where we're at? And I like to set the stage of the global stage. There appears to be this showdown of East versus West, right? We have all these people coming out. Ray Dalio talking about it. Graham Allison, the Thucydides trap, the decline of the West, the rise of the East. How do you make sense of this, where we're at?
Well, I think Ray Dalio, you mentioned Ray Dalio, he's quite correct. I think we're at the end of the debt cycle. I mean, look at the US national debt right now. It's almost right now today, I'm looking at the USDebtClock.org, right? It's 36.88 trillion US dollars. That's almost $37 trillion. And I mean, you probably know this already. The US, on an annual basis, just to service this debt, like I'm talking about interest rate payments, is at a little bit above $1 trillion right now. So, I mean, this is unsustainable. And it has been unsustainable for a while now. So I don't think, what's happening right now in the world is a singular event. What I mean by that is that a lot of things that we see right now that are surfacing has been progressing over the years. For example, you look at what's happening with the U.S. Treasury, what Scott Bessent has been saying a lot lately. He is really focused on U.S. Treasury bonds, especially the long duration U.S. Treasury bonds. Okay, because as you know, the pickup of U.S. long duration Treasury bonds is probably insufficient. Okay, otherwise Janet Yellen wouldn't have financed the U.S. government primarily using T-bills, right? Now, why is that? Because over the last 5-6 years, and you said you follow Luke Roman, and he pointed this out. Countries such as China has been decreasing their U.S. Treasury bond holdings. So put all that together, right? What I just said just now and what I said earlier with the U.S. debt situation. You have a ballooning U.S. debt situation for almost $37 trillion, right? They're adding $1 trillion per every 90 days or less. In some cases, 60 days, they're adding $1 trillion. And you have foreigners like China, either decreasing the U.S. Treasury bond holdings or just holding it steady without increasing it. Then what you have is a perfect storm where the U.S. government has to make some tough choices.
So, what you just said, and
Yes.
yesterday, there's all this talk about bonds, and so specifically, Ray Dalio came out yesterday talking about the problem. The problem will start with the bonds, and then that's sort of like the marker, and then all hell will break loose after that. Thomas Massey commenting on that, and a whole bunch of other analysts. So, I guess my next question is, on this podcast, I've been trying to, figure things out through this podcast. It's been one of my number one purposes for doing it. And I've interviewed folks on both sides, the collapsologists, right, who've been talking about this coming sort of collapse of America. It was the end of the cycle, as you say, the default, the deficits, the debt, and all that. And then others who say, America will just get knocked down a notch, but it will remain a superpower. It's got a lot going for it. It's between two oceans, a lot of population, resources, and all that. But lately, and I go back and forth daily because none of us can exactly predict the future. But now, given what you're saying and others, I oscillate, and now I'm going back. One of my guests, who I've had on a number of times, Russian American Dmitry Orlov, and he's talked about this Soviet-style collapse of America. That at some point America would experience its Russia's 1990s Russia sort of moment. So, would you say, how do you think this plays out? Do you think America will just go through a slow decline, or do you think it will be a shocking sort of event where echoes of the past of 1930s Great Depression or whatever?
I'm more in the camp of what you just said about some of your guests saying that the U.S. will just get taken down a notch. Okay, that's my base case. I don't think it's the end of the world. I don't think it's I always use this term, Mad Max situation, where all hell breaks loose. I think eventually, after the US try everything, it will do the right thing. And there'll be some sort of a landing. It might be a hard landing, but it probably won't be catastrophic to the point where it loses its status as a world power.
All right, yeah, that makes that makes sense. There's so many things I want to ask you. Maybe why don't I ask you about the dollar, because that's something that's talked about, and de-dollarization. And before getting to China, maybe just asking about that gold and Bitcoin. What do you see happening with the dollar? There's many publications talking about de-dollarization, saying it's a long process. Again, kind of alluding to what you said, that it's not going to lead necessarily to hyperinflation and the death of the dollar, but that basically the dollar will be replaced as a world reserve, or it will lose its world reserve status. You've got Jeffrey Sachs. I'm not a fan of Jeffrey Sachs because he's come out recently saying we need a world government. But he was saying that in 10 years, the legacy systems no longer function, and so Swift will become obsolete, and CBDCs, from around collectively around the world, will replace the world reserve. Others are saying the euro or a basket of currencies like the IMF special drawing rights. What are your thoughts when it comes to the dollar? And then, as you say, if the U.S. moves down a notch, it won't have the weapon that it has in the dollar, weaponizing it. So your thoughts there?
I think, we should look at the US Treasury market instead, because that's what the US government looks at. Like the dollar is almost a means to an end. It's a function of the US Treasury market. That's what it is, the US dollar. So what they are concerned about is a functional US Treasury market where they don't technically default on the debt. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Like that part? So, because you asked me, or you commented earlier in our conversation where, you talked about how the US debt may be out of control, right?
Mm.
Or they might go default. Well, if they are willing to stop QT, I mean, they're probably already doing QE behind the scenes, not in that name. But if, let's say, they're willing to officially restart QE for US Treasuries, right? Essentially, what it is printing money to buy their own sovereign bond, then the US government will not default. But the price to pay for that is that the US dollar is going to go down in value on a relative basis. Now, I think that's the choice they'll eventually have to make. Right now, for lack of a better word, it looks like they are just dragging their feet. But as you've just said, people like Ray Dalio and others are beating the drum, saying that we are, converging on a point of critical crisis where they will have to make a choice. That's why I think you see, like different assets behaving the way that they're behaving recently, because it's anticipating that switch that is coming up very soon.
Before
So yes, sorry. Oh, I was just going to say, essentially, that's what I just described as a form of yield curve control. Sorry.
And yeah, before getting to those assets like a gold, yeah. Bitcoin hit his record yesterday, probably this morning. I want to get your thoughts on that. But then that switch, that decision that has to be made. Again, what do you think then happens to the dollar? Does on the international scene, does it then become just less of a position as other countries? We hear all this stuff. BRICS. All countries just are increasingly carrying out activities within their own national currencies. You for many years I've had on Alistair McLeod and others. They talk about these gold exchanges in China. I want to ask you about that. You threw out on X this rumor that Saudi Arabia might be opening its own vault, which could be then used for the yuan gold exchanges. And so what do you think then happens to the dollar? Does it go away? It's no longer the world reserve, or on paper it remains the world reserve, but everyone else is increasingly using their own currencies?
So what that rumor is actually just the SGE, which is the Shanghai Gold Exchange, okay? Opening up Shanghai Gold Exchange vaults overseas. Now, they have already officially announced it for Hong Kong, but, the Chinese government actually already released their future policy framework, where they're saying that they will do this basically at multiple financial centers overseas. And my friend Bai Oriental Ghost on X have recently explained that that's how the Chinese government usually functions. It publicly releases these press releases where it explains its upcoming framework for certain things it want to implement. But when it does implement these things, like setting up a vault in Saudi Arabia for SGE, there might not be a lot of news about that. So we might not even find out immediately that it's happening until, let's say, the local news in Saudi Arabia picks it up, and then the Western news outlet picks it up. So if you just expand on what you just said, what does that do? Why is it so important? Why is it such a game changer that a physical gold and silver, potentially, but they're talking about gold here, vault is going to be opened at Saudi Arabia and other financial centers around the world? Well, right now, a lot of countries in the past, and even right now, when they trade with each other, they use the US dollar. Isn't that funny? So let's say you are Saudi Arabia and you're China, you trade with each other using the US dollar, even though, the US is not involved in that transaction. So that's part of the US dollar being the world reserve currency and the US dollar hegemony, right? Okay. But what did the US do in the last 5 years? It weaponized the US dollar, it weaponized the SWIFT, and it confiscated Russia's US treasuries. So China sees that. And what has China been doing? China is building these avenues where its trade partners can transact with China using the RMB yen, okay? The renminbi, RMB yen. But the problem is the RMB yen is a two-tier system. So China is capital controls, right? What I mean is that when I say two-tier system, is that the RMB yen has the domestic RMB component, where it is under currency control, okay, capital controls, and then you have the offshore RMB. That's what countries like Saudi Arabia or China's trading partners overseas use. Now, if everything switches over from US dollars to RMB for China's trading partners, that trading partner wants to know that that RMB can be easily converted to something, okay, that is internationally recognized and is not subjected to any sort of capital controls and has deep liquidity. So what fits into that bill is physical gold. Okay?
Mhm.
Now, the Shanghai Gold Exchange has satisfied all that, even in the past. But the problem is the physical gold was held in Shanghai. So now, with these votes being established overseas at the trading partners of China, their jurisdiction, then the final piece of the puzzle is being solved, basically. is being fitted, where China's trading partner can use the RMB, and if they want, they can immediately take that RMB and get physical gold from a vault that is at their own jurisdiction.
Yeah, this is a game changer, and on gold. So I guess when that happens, we'll see a huge shift away from the dollar. There's been all this talk. Do you think eventually some countries or groupings of countries do they go to gold back? I mean, we're seeing in Africa now. I was reading Zimbabwe has gone to a gold backed currency, and there was an article from January, I think, talking about other African countries looking into that. Do there's been all this talk about a BRICS backed gold currency, but really nothing. It's just, in my opinion, it's just been all hype and no action when it comes to the BRICS stuff. But and then I want to ask you the second part is all the Bitcoin. What's going on with this Bitcoin crypto stuff, particularly in the West and the U.S. It seems like they're trying to do something there. But what role then will gold play in the future? Just for transactions away from the dollar, or do you think it'll back national currencies or an international currency?
Like I just explained, I think physical gold is simply going to be the international reserve asset that is neutral, meaning that no government controls it. So you can't just cancel physical gold, right? You can't push a button and say that physical gold is no longer valid. So that's, I think, the role of physical gold is basically going to run in parallel with US Treasury bonds.
What price? I know this is nobody knows, but I just see no, in purchasing gold for individuals. Let's just say now, I don't think you can go wrong ever, really, whether it comes to silver or gold. Because if we look at the chart, like historically, it's never gone down in terms of real purchasing power. And so it's like I feel like you absolutely cannot go wrong. Like ever in history, you've never lost. And it's I put a percentage of whatever savings I have. I just buy and I don't check the price, and it's there as insurance. If like someday if it's an emergency, I don't have cash, I'll sell it. But and I believe James Rickards and others have said you want to have. Some people say 10%. I think it's probably better to have something not financial advice, but have like maybe 20% in precious metals or something. But what are your thoughts for individuals when it comes to purchasing silver or gold? Or
I think physical gold is definitely something that everybody should have. Simply because, like I said, physical gold itself is quickly becoming an alternative to US Treasury bonds for sovereigns. So you see, in the past 5-6 years, central banks around the world have been accelerating their purchases or stacking of physical gold. So if you are an individual, and you want to protect yourself in the upcoming, I know this word has been used a lot, reset. Okay, let's just use that word, reset. What better to own than physical gold? I mean, that's what the central banks around the world, that's what they are buying. Instead of US Treasury bonds, in some cases, or diversifying away from US Treasury bonds. So I think in that sense, as an individual, you do what they do. They are stacking physical gold. You should do that as well.
on Bitcoin then, and the crypto space, I reckon from reading your posts, you're not too keen on Bitcoin. a lot of it just isn't making sense for me. I just don't understand how something like that is going up. Like I feel like I've never seen anything like this in history. Or if I have to point to an example, it's tulips, like tulip mania, and maybe I'll be proven wrong, but it's just I don't know. And I prefer hard assets like gold or property. But one thing I feel like they're trying to do is to create this new, a Bretton Woods 3.0. We had gold back, Bretton Woods 1.0, and then I call Bretton Woods 2.0 is 1971 when we moved to the oil backed dollar, so to speak. That has finished, and now many people have been talking about we need a Bretton Woods 3.0, and it seems like what they're trying to do is shift from the dead oil backed Bretton Woods 2 arrangement to like a Bitcoin backed, energy certificate backed, digital dollar 3.0. And it seems like there's all this talk about Bitcoin strategic reserve. BlackRock has come in, and it's almost like they're trying to reset the dollar into this digital format. And because I think part of their other agenda is to bring about this sort of these digital systems for everything, digital passports, digital currencies, digital controls. And so how do you make sense of Bitcoin, cryptos in general? We've got these stable coins, Tether and all that.
So, I talked a bit about Bitcoin on my Threads. And I believe what they're doing with Bitcoin, first of all, I think what is happening with Bitcoin right now is that the stable coins that they use to buy Bitcoin, the tethers, etc., right? They are buying US treasuries, okay, as their reserves. So essentially, the more people buy Bitcoin, okay, then more people are indirectly buying US treasuries.
Mm-hmm.
Does that part make any sense? Have you heard that theory before from other people? Right?
Yeah.
Like, where that like Tether and the stablecoins are tying the US Treasury market together with the Bitcoin market. Okay, so I think that's what's happening, and Bitcoin, in my opinion, is mostly an American phenomenon, especially now with this U.S. Treasury component to it. So to me, it makes sense that the powers that be in the U.S. want to pump up Bitcoin from time to time. Like I said on one of my threads, I said it might get up to $200,000 per Bitcoin. Now, if you're an American, why not buy some Bitcoin? I said it myself. I said if I'm an American, I probably diversify and buy some Bitcoin just because of that. Right? It's just, in a way, it's just a more limited supply, more secure version of the US dollar. If you want to put it that. Correct?
Mm-hmm.
But if you are somebody who is overseas, like myself, I'm not an American. The risk to hold this digital asset is fairly high. Simply because, like in countries like China, they don't even, like the banks don't allow you to transact Bitcoin. Like you can't redeem the Bitcoin into cash. It's not even legal, okay, to transact in Bitcoin publicly. So does that answer your question? I mean, it's not completely negative, right? I see the utility of Bitcoin. on the American side. But as a foreigner, I just see it as something that is really too risky for someone like myself to hold.
No, I agree with you. And it's I think it's good, okay, to have a percentage, because I feel like, as you mentioned, it's currently we're riding the wave up, but then my biggest question becomes, what's the end game? And I'm on the fence again, where I think what they're trying to do in the West is, as you said, they're trying to prop up the treasury market and maybe sort of reset the dollar into this sort of digital dollar or CBDCs, right? So I feel like in some countries where the state has more control, they just deploy, they say, okay, you people, citizens, you don't have a choice. You're going to have an account with the central bank, like maybe in Europe, right? Or China, and it's CBDCs. You don't have a choice, but given the American culture and history of having a more democratic system, at least on paper, they have a harder time doing that. So I call them PBDCs, private bank digital currencies, which are effectively the same function. And so it's like, what they're trying to do then is Bitcoin might bring us into this new system, or I could see Bitcoin collapsing somehow, and then they'll have to figure out another way. Do you see Bitcoin eventually, the price collapsing?
It's very possible. I mean, it collapsed several times already, right? Like 90%. So who's to say it's not going to do it again? It's just, to me, it just makes sense for me to hold physical gold and silver versus something like Bitcoin. As someone who don't live in America and, who's not an American. I mean, you laid out all the risk yourself, right? Like, I mean, they can one day just shut down Bitcoin if they want to. It's possible, right? Or if they don't shut it down, people say, well, they can't shut it down. Well, they can make it so difficult to turn that Bitcoin back into fiat that the price in US dollar terms plummets. So those are all risk that is associated with Bitcoin that, a foreigner, non-American such as myself, do not need to expose myself to.
Yeah, makes sense. Let me ask you about the economic war. The tariffs. It seems like the West, reading your feed, reading other stuff the past few days, it seems like the West it's been a bluff, this trade war against China, and that they're retreating with their tails. I think increasingly we're seeing the U.S. retreat with its tail between its legs, like we see with the Houthis in Yemen. It seems like they've been just blowing billions of dollars and losing, so they're like, okay, we're going to stop that. Same thing with the tariffs and this trade war. What are your thoughts there? What's going on? It seems like the Chinese. Who was I listening to yesterday? I was listening to something. I don't know if it was your podcast or someone else saying that the Chinese remain on the street. The Chinese remain defiant against the West, and they're saying, we're not going to buckle. It seems like China and the East have the upper hand here. What are your thoughts when it comes to all this tariff and trade war?
I basically made my fortune in the manufacturing business in China. I can tell you this whole trade war situation, we were aware of it years ago, right? During Trump's first term. So we always had that dangling above our heads. We knew that one day the hammer will probably come down and the tariffs are going to shoot up. I mean, the difference this time, of course, versus Trump's first term is that everything is being tariffed, right? During his first term, certain things were tariffed, but not the toys, not the plastics, not the just everyday items, not the clothing, etc. But I believe what's happening now, even after the rollback, after Trump, sort of like roll back the tariffs, China is still being tariffed 30% across the board. So what does that mean? That means a lot of items that the American buyers, it's not like a must-have. Those items are being cut. They're no longer buying it. Whatever, the American buyers are buying right now are things that they cannot do without. So they're buying it and they are absorbing the 30% tariffs out of their own pockets. You might ask myself why. I've heard a lot of Americans or even Trump said the Chinese are going to pay for it. Well, no, because the Chinese were making, on the larger orders, okay, of quantity. Chinese manufacturers were making an average of maybe 10% gross margin. So how is it possible that Chinese manufacturers take on or pay for the tariffs when they were only making 10%? The tariffs are 30%.
Yeah, so that was always going to be the case, that it's who's going to pay for it is the West. I mean, even Peter Schiff pointed out Scott Bessent was being questioned about this, and he couldn't answer the question when he was asked who's going to end up paying the tariffs, and he couldn't tell the truth. It's going to be Americans.
Americans pay for it, exactly, right? So you ask me what's happening in China. Tell you the truth, right? The people who are complaining in China, let's say they complain in public, and they do, even within my circle, because I know a lot of manufacturers, right? I'm like in their circle of social media on WeChat, and they share their thoughts, etc. And sometimes they complain. They say it's unfair. We government is not negotiating with the Americans properly, so we're getting hit with the 30% tariffs. Guess what? They shut up pretty quickly. Not because the Chinese government is looking at our conversation. It's because of peer pressure from the rest of us, Chinese citizens. You have to understand, these complaints are, for lack of a better word, is childish. Like I said, we knew this was going to come for years. So if you are a Chinese factory and your American customer base exceed the average of 18%, that's the average, by the way, 18% of let's say an average Chinese manufacturer's business is from the American customers. Now, let's say your factory in particular has a 70% allocation to American customers, and you're getting hit really hard by these tariffs. And you complain on social media, you blame the government. You think you'll get any sympathy from the rest of us? The answer is no. You had plenty of time to pivot, to expand your customer base outside of America. You failed to do so. It's your personal problem. So that is where we stand in terms of sentiment in China.
Where do you feel the trade war then takes us? How did this end? How does this end? I'm increasingly hearing, it's, again, you mentioned cycles earlier, the historical cycles, history rhymes, repeats, rhymes. And people say, first you have all these series of problems, trade wars become real wars, and we see the West, everybody's militarizing. China has, this is leading to my subsequent question, but China's got I think the biggest navy now. They're just pumping stuff out. You're seeing the U.S. reactivate a whole host of military bases on islands. There's all these increasing military exercises with nuclear capable B-52 bombers, and so you're seeing all over the place this sort of stuff. How does this trade war then play out, this tariff situation, and then your thoughts on this specter that the media talks about always of a third world war or a military conflict confrontation?
So your China is called Geopolitics and Empire. So I'm going to go with that angle. I think China will not initiate war. The war is the last option for China. Okay? And right now, as it stands, the US tried to isolate China by strong arming its Western allies and other countries at, increasing their tariffs on China. So the US want to box China in, basically. It realizes that, just the US alone raising tariffs on China is not enough. It wants Europe to do the same thing, South America to do the same thing, and basically pretty much everybody, right? So let's put it this way. If the US is successful at doing that, boxing in China like that, or let's say cut off China's energy needs, like what it did to the Japanese pre-World War II, I can see us potentially heading into a World War III. But fortunately for us, China already prepared alternative strategies for, number one, energy. Look at China's EVs. China, like new vehicles on the road right now, over 50% are EVs in China. So China is lessening its dependence on crude oil while, increasing its crude oil imports from places like Russia so that the US cannot block that import. So it's doing two things on the end, not more than two things. The diversifying energy imports in terms of like crude oil from Russia, and then also diversifying its vehicles on the road to EV so that it doesn't depend on crude oil as much. It is also building a lot more nuclear power plants. So my point is, on the energy side, China should be fine. The US probably cannot do what it did to the Japanese pre-World War II, cutting off China's energy supply. And then in terms of trade, it looks like the rest of the world is not listening to the US. Like the rest of the world is cutting deals with China. So if that's the case, it's just the US, erecting these tariffs to try to beat China. But it looks like to me that the US is hurting itself more than China with these tariffs.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Everything that you say. I had on a Serbian, Nick Stankovic, who's been on the podcast, and he lives in China, and he mentioned what you said, and it's something that's not often talked about or very obvious. It's behind the veneer what you mentioned, and lately I've been bringing up the comparison of 1941 Pearl Harbor and Japan. In my opinion, that was a form of a false flag operation, which is, I think all countries have carried out false flag operations. The Japanese did with China and in Manchuria, the train station, the Manchuria incident. But I think the Russians, have with the Moscow apartment bombings. We can talk about 9/11, but I think statistically, the West has carried out the highest quantity of false flag operations. And when we look at Japan, I studied in Geneva. One of my instructors told us that there was like a series of 7 or 8 steps where the U.S. put Japan in a corner, and one of the final and most powerful was completely cutting off their oil. And the West wanted Japan to strike first. So in the eyes of the world public opinion, they can say, oh, look, Japan attacked us. Now we have to go after them. And I feel like that's what they're trying to do with Taiwan. And you'll read these Western papers. I feel like in the near term, China won't take Taiwan. I think that I feel like the Pentagon wants China to move on Taiwan because that will then be the pretext for the U.S. to enter into military conflict. Just a quick thought. Any thoughts on that?
Well, what does China need Taiwan for? Like, other than strategic importance, right? Because Taiwan is such a large landmass that is right, basically, is what, like 200 miles away from China mainland. Is pretty close, right? So strategically, I understand that. But what else does China need Taiwan for? Semiconductors, right? But guess what? China is catching up to Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing. I'm thinking probably within 5 years, as fast as 5 years, maybe 6 or 7 years, China will be fully caught up. So at that point, China don't even need Taiwan for semiconductors. It's almost like you live in Mongolia, right?
Yeah.
Right now, I'm sorry, you live in Mongolia right now, or you used to live in Mongolia?
No, previously I used to live.
Previously. But you live in Mexico. So, okay, anyway. So my point is, taking back Taiwan is almost like a historical mission for the Chinese government to do so, to reunify the country, right? And it can do that non-militarily. Once China mainland can do everything that Taiwan does. That's my point. I don't think the Chinese leadership will be dumb enough to militarily attack Taiwan if Taiwan is nothing more than just a floating landmass with no technological value in 5 years.
Makes total sense. And I think I failed to mention in my previous point, was mentioning Nick Stankovic, who pointed out how that was very important, how China has switched to EVs, and they're going to have a massive coal use for electricity production. They can get their oil from Iran and Russia and elsewhere, and gas. And so one of the reasons that they're going to EVs is not to depend on oil, but on electricity, right, which they're generating from the coal. I was reading Robert Bryce, who does great work. I've interviewed him on my old radio program. He pointed out that India and China, but I think specifically China, with its coal-backed electricity production alone, will be more than all of America's combined energy production from all of the different sources, which is pretty crazy. Would you say then the future generally will be brighter than for the East, for the BRICS countries? What are your thoughts on BRICS and multipolarity and all that?
I live in Hong Kong, so I think I really, I put my money where my mouth is. I voted for China. As a matter of fact, once I rotate out of my miners, I'm probably going to be heavily invested in Chinese stocks. I'm already in Chinese stocks, even though a lot of people don't like it. They think Chinese stocks are going to dump because of the trade war with the US, etc. So to answer your question, I do see a bright future for China. China has already built all the infrastructure. It's developing its, soft power right now, while, fighting this trade war. And within 10 years, I think you'll be shocked at what China will be able to accomplish. I mean, as a matter of fact, I urge anybody who's interested to see what China has accomplished so far to come to China for a visit. Even, let's say, if you visited China 5 years ago, come visit again. Because just in 5 years, China has changed so much. If you come to, let's say, Shenzhen, Shanghai, Beijing, or even the second tier cities like Wuhan, like Chongqing, okay, in the interior, it almost feels like Chinese cities are cities in the future.
Yeah, that's what I'm seeing online. And to your point, Simon Dixon, who I've had long ago on the podcast, he recently released a fantastic podcast that he did 3 hours long on BlackRock. It's not what was the title? I think it's BlackRock versus the world. And he was making the point that the West is spent in terms of return on investment, and that the BlackRocks and all those the big transnational elite companies, they're now going to be moving and investing in the East, India, China, the BRICS countries, because there's so much growth potential there. I mean, those are developing countries, right? So there's much longer runway there, and there will be all this development work, as you just pointed out, in China. And so, would you sort of agree then that that's sort of what the future looks like?
I completely agree. I think after this is over, the reset, we're in the middle of it right now, where basically all currencies around the world is being revalued against physical gold and potentially silver. Once this is over, the growth is probably going to come from Asia. Countries such as China, India, and the rest of Southeast Asia.
And well, on China, you already answered some of my previous questions. Let me throw this one at you. Enlighten us. I heard you talking about it on Sirius Report. The social credit system. What's up with that?
So basically, like I said to Paul, it doesn't exist. Like there's no social credit score system. Okay? I mean, there's a social credit system, but not social credit score system where the government monitors you day and night, and then you get deducted or at a centrally compiled score where, let's say if you're a bad boy, you get deducted a couple points. And if you're a good boy, you get a couple points more. That system does not exist. Okay? What does exist is, let's say you're a criminal or you do something that is antisocial, right? Or you are a serious financial criminal who is, pending trial, not yet determined to be guilty, let's say, right? Then what they do is they take away some of your ability to do certain things using public transport, or like, what they call high spending luxury activities. Okay? So that's what that is. And by the way, like I agree with that, because that keeps our society that much more safer. It's just like what I told Paul about the surveillance system in China. There are cameras everywhere if you come to China. That's true. But what did that do? we almost have zero theft, petty theft, none. Okay? I mean, when we talked off camera, you told me that Mexico is kind of bad with that, correct?
I mean, in terms
In
of
terms of security.
security,
Yeah.
it's chaos. Yeah.
Yeah. It's chaos, right? But China doesn't have that anymore. I mean, I'll tell you something. Kidnappings in China used to be a big problem. Now it's down to almost nil. Okay? I mean, like people who were kidnapped when they were kids, let's say 20 years ago, they're being found today. Why? Because of all the cameras everywhere in the country. So, to me, China is just a safer country. I don't need to look behind my back every second. Of course, you can argue, let's say, 20 years down the road, when President Xi is no longer our president, a tyrant comes along, take control of the system, everything can be turned around and used against us, right? That's a possibility. I don't debate that. But for now, it is being used for the good of Chinese society.
So you hit on my point, and I
Yes.
wanted to bring this up. And when I approach this topic, I do it with nuance, right? Not like with some other podcasters who say there's a social credit score, and I think nuance here and having this sort of nuanced, respectful debate. And I think this is one place where you and I disagree, and others like Nick Stankovic, who lives in China, and I think it's more of a philosophical disagreement, and we can agree to disagree, and then let me know. I want to give my view, and if you can sort of respectfully agree to disagree with me, if what I'm saying makes sense, and it's, you kind of alluded to that in your last statement, and as you said, there's no social credit system. I can agree to that, but I will respond. I'll say yes, but there's an algorithm ghetto. I in 2020 I interviewed the renowned Jewish American historian Edwin Black, and he wrote this book on IBM and the Holocaust and eugenics, and he's using the term algorithm ghetto, which I feel like that's effectively what you just described in China, but it's not. China's not ground zero for it. It's a global phenomenon. It's in Mexico here. It's in the US. It's in Canada. It's in Europe. It's in Kazakhstan. And it's effectively these digital systems now, where it's, cashless payments in China and Sweden. Very few people use cash. I read this morning, next year, the US will phase out pennies. They won't be making new pennies anymore. So there you go. And so, where you need digital payments for everything, you need your smartphone for everything, facial recognition, digital passports for movement controls. And so my sort of problem with that is we're already seeing a thought crime, basically. Like you mentioned, some people having restricted mobility, maybe for some of them for valid reasons, but I was deplatformed from PayPal by the American Department of Homeland Security. So you see what I'm. And this week, Alina Lip, she's a German citizen and she lives in Russia. She's an EU citizen. The EU just put sanctions on her, froze her bank accounts, and she cannot enter the EU. So she's been denied entry into her own country. So my view is more philosophical, is that I think eventually, I fear this type of system where, yes, maybe it's doing some good now, but I feel eventually it can be used against us. And for some people like myself, we are already experiencing negative aspects. So would you say my argument is fair?
It is. You fear, a system that I see the benefit of right now. You fear that it's going to be used against us in the future. Like I said, that may be the case. But right now, I see the benefits, and it's making Chinese society, our country, a safer place. That's why I see. I'm not, I don't shy away from that. I tell people that. I live here, just like you live in Mexico. So I'm not speaking out of from a hypothetical scenario. I'm not dreaming it up. I'm living it. Do you know that since China opened the borders after COVID, right? Because COVID, everything was closed down. The citizens of Hong Kong are going to China, mainland, en masse. Like a lot of them don't even spend any of their holidays in Hong Kong. They all go to China. Why? Because the Chinese malls are better. Okay? The merchandise is better. The roads are better. The air is better because of the EVs. Everything is better. So why not? And everything is cheaper up there compared to Hong Kong. It's better and it's cheaper. In Mexico, it might be cheaper, but not necessarily better than the US. Like you said, sometimes it's chaotic. Mm-hmm. But China is better and it's cheaper. So what do the people in Hong Kong do? They might go on X and they complain a lot. They complain about the Chinese Communist Party, etc., all day. But what do they actually do? In reality, they are spending all their time in mainland China. So I'm a realist. I look at what is happening in reality. So you might tell me, oh, maybe in 30 years, China is going to turn into 1984, right? Or have you seen that movie, The Running Man?
Oh yeah,
right. Like how they have that's like a crazy movie because it predicted everything that is happening now, right? With down to the AI manipulating video footage. Okay, it did that in that movie to frame Arnold, right? Okay, you can do that now with AI, and did that CBDC thing that you talk about, like how your money's no good, it just stops your credit. They did that in that movie. So is China going to become that? I don't know. But I know that it is working now.
Right.
It's working for me now as a citizen, right? So I see the danger. Not stupid, right? So we got to work diligently as Chinese citizens to stop that from happening. But we don't want to. It's like a gun, right? Let's use the gun as an example. You can use a gun to rob a bank or murder someone. But you can also use the gun to defend yourself, to do good, right? So it's the person who operates the firearm or the gun that matters. And that's my point.
Right. And I'm not denying, the quality of life in China now is, I'm sure, excellent, great, all that. And what else was I going to say? And, effectively my contention is that I view this as a global project, not something exclusive to China. So my fear is that, all countries will be have these types of systems. And again, its origin is not, China. I'm not, pointing the finger at China. But my qualm is just philosophically. I fear that eventually we'll end up in a dystopia, and we see some signs right now, and that's it's a sword of Damocles, kind of as you say. Right now, the quality of life is good. It's facilitating, these types of systems are facilitating travel and work and all that. But I feel like it's a sword of Damocles that eventually there's that Russian play. What was it? I always forget his name. Pushkin or something, that says if there's a loaded gun in the first act, you can bet that by the and before the play ends, it's going to go off. But I guess one of my last questions I wanted to ask you about. I've read Kai-Fu Lee on AI, the tech sphere, AI and everything in China. There's Huawei shops here in Mexico. I'm actually considering purchasing sometime in the near future for the first time a Huawei phone. And I just read that they just released the first laptop with Harmony OS, which I think is based on iterations of Linux. And it's just wow. Like, I mean, some of the stuff that's coming out of China just seems way more advanced than anything we have in the West. Could you give us just thoughts on what's going on with the technology in China for everyday consumer use and beyond? And where do you see it going in the future? And is it sort of more advanced than what we have in the West?
It is super advanced. I do all my shopping on Alibaba. Like the Alibaba retail site is called Taobao in China, in Hong Kong. Um, you've probably seen this already on X. For the same thing that Americans pay, I probably pay 20, 30% of what they pay because I directly buy from the factory on the Taobao application. And then they have something similar to Uber, which is ultra convenient, runs from WeChat, which is owned by Tencent. And then I can pay pretty much for everything through my Tencent account. So willingly, right? Because in China, they also accept cash. But it's just a lot more convenient to pull out your phone and then just use your Tencent account to pay for everything. And if you come to China, to Shenzhen, and you sit down at a restaurant, you'll be shocked. Everything is computerized. So you would use your camera, you scan the QR code, the menu pops up right on your WeChat account or on your browser, and then you can order right on your iPhone or your Android phone. So that's where we're at. And in terms of like EVs, like you talked about, and I talked about, and your guest talked about, China is probably the best in the world. Recently I went to China and we called several times, by the way, because my brother came to visit us. So we have, many people, 7 people. We call these, minivans to pick us up. And these minivans were made, brand new minivans that were made by BYD. Are you aware of that company called BYD? It's something it's a company that Warren Buffett invested in the past.
I was just going to mention here on the streets of Mexico, when I go out every day, I am increasingly seeing, I'm increasingly seeing more Teslas, but I think even to a higher extent, more BYDs.
Yeah, because BYD is cheap and it's good. I mean, cheap doesn't mean bad. Look at what's happening with doesn't necessarily mean bad. Look at what's happening with India and Pakistan, right? China's geopolitics and empire. Look at what happened. The Chinese jet, which is I think only 3rd generation, is beating the French-made Indian jet. And I think the cost of the Chinese jet is like 1/5 of the cost of the French jets that the Indians bought, right? So, cheap doesn't necessarily mean bad, and BYD makes some very good EVs. What I see increasingly happening in China is that the BYD minivans, the luxury ones, are increasingly replacing the Japanese luxury vans. So that's another phenomenon that we see on the technology side in China. I say, to your audience, just come to China for a visit. There's so many things that is amazing in China right now, big and small, that I cannot spend hours telling audience on your show because we have a limited time frame, right? It's best that they come visit and see it with their own eyes.
I visited China, I think 21 years ago now, and we were there for a couple of weeks. It was a history tour because I was a history major, and we had our Jewish professor from the Bronx who was married to a Chinese or Taiwanese, and he was fluent in Mandarin. And we went to everywhere, Shanghai, Beijing, Xi'an, We saw the Great Wall in many different locations, including in the desert, which was fascinating to see. And so I had a deep experience of China. But as you say, that was 21 years ago, so it's a whole nother ball game today. And I was going to mention as well, when I was living in Kazakhstan, we were using Alibaba, and it was super cheap, and you got it quick. Even here in Mexico, people use Alibaba, and it's good stuff. So it seems like China is where it's at when it comes to the economy, the tech, development, manufacturing, and all that. So we've pretty much covered the waterfront. Is there any other sort of issue that I didn't bring up that you think is important to mention?
I think this is very good. Thank you for inviting me on your show and give me a chance to explain what's happening in China to your audience. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And is the best place for people to follow you on your X account?
Correct. It's at King Kong 9888. That's my X account. Yes.
All right. Well, thanks for being on the podcast, Eric.
Thank you very much.